Everybody at home. I'm Nicole. I'm the manager at Read It Again Bookstore, and I'm joined today by Cat Rambo.
Hello.
Hello. I'm going to read her bio for everybody. So Nebula, World Fantasy, and Endeavour Award nominee Cat Rambo's published work includes 200 plus stories, 2 novels, 5 collections, a cookbook, a travel guide, and 2 books for writers. She runs the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers, which offers live and on-demand online writing classes aimed at speculative fiction writers. She is a 2-term president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and her 2020 publications include 2 novels, Exiles of Tabat, published by Wordfire Press, and You Sexy Thing, published by Tor and Macmillan. Thanks for joining us today, Cat.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
I'm excited to see the interior of a bookstore.
Even on the screen, yes.
Yeah.
Well, behind you is pretty much a bookstore in and of itself. It all flows together very well.
It really does. And this is my study, which also has the walls, which are the right color for green screen. So if I put up a green screen, I can look like I'm wandering through space or jungles or water. It's very nice.
That sounds like the perfect setting for all of your books. So I mentioned in your bio that you're doing some writing workshops. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, I have been. This is actually the 10th year of the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers, which I started because basically people that I kept running into at conventions wanted to take classes with me and said, how do I do it? And Google Hangouts came out. So I started doing an online workshop. And then a few years into it, I started bringing in some other people, brought in Ann Leckie to teach about space opera, brought Shannon McGuire in to talk about cryptozoology. And now we've got several dozen people come and teach on a regular basis, lots of classes going on every weekend. And we've now got a virtual campus part where we do daily co-working and have a weekly story discussion group. And it's been my key to productivity actually this year.
That sounds amazing. We've put the links to it in the comments. So if anybody wants to look into that more, they can do that there. And especially our sci-fi book club, we mentioned Ann Leckie. We read Ancillary Justice in January, and Sean McGuire, we read Middle Game. So if you like those, you should check out Cat Rambo and her writing workshop. So the book that we're here to discuss today is Carpe Glitter, which is a little novelette. Would you like to describe it for us a little?
Yeah, this is a piece that it had a sort of weird inception, which is that somebody came and said, can you write something diesel punk? And I started it and then sort of abandoned it and blew them off, and then came back to it after I had been reading about a hoarder. And I thought, what would it be like to be going through somebody's leftover belongings and discover a magical artifact? And so this is the story of Persephone Aim, whose grandmother was a stage magician back in the day, and a very famous one, and also turns out to have been a hoarder. So I'm actually going to read the very beginning of the piece, the first few pages. Carpe glitter, my grandmother Gloria always said, seize the glitter. And that was what I remembered best about her, the glitter. A dazzle of rhinestone, a waft of perfume, lipstick like a red banner across her mouth. Underneath all that, a wiry little old lady with silver hair and vampire pale skin. Not that she was a vampire, of course, but Gloria Aim hung with everyone who was anyone during her days in the Vegas crowd. Celebrities, presidents, journalists, they all came to her show at the Sparkle Dome, watched her strut her stuff in a black top hat and fishnet stockings, conjuring flames and doves, never card tricks, which she hated, making ghosts speak to loved ones in the audience. And when she stepped off the stage, she left in a scintillating dazzle like a fairy queen stepping off her throne. All that shine. And at home, she was a grubby hoarder. I mopped sweat off my forehead with the hem of my t-shirt and attacked another pile of magazines. Dust wafted up to fill my nostrils and make me sneeze, drifted down to coat the hairs on my forearms with grit. Something had rotted in the corner. I was doing that side once I'd cleared a path to it and breathing through my mouth in the meantime. This had once been intended as a guest room, but it had been taken over by a troop of china-headed dolls stacked atop piles of brittle newspapers and magazines. No cat pee, I'd been spared that at least in these back rooms, closed off for at least a couple of decades. Grandmother had bought the house when she was at the height of her first fortune. She just burst onto the stage magician scene, a woman from Brooklyn who trained herself in sleight of hand and studied under the most famous female stage magician of her time, Susan Day. The nearest heap of magazines, in fact, flaking away at my touch, showed grandmother and her mentor on the uppermost cover, a poster from their brief tour together just after World War II. Glamorous, older Day, blonde hair worn up and eyes blue as turquoise. Grandmother, bright and shiny, not just from the rhinestones glittering across her chest, but starry-eyed, her grin so wide it stretched her mouth. The stack held dozens of copies of the same issue, no matter how far down I went. A swarm of silverfish scurried away as I lifted out the last one. I'd get the room cleared before bringing out my arsenal of bug spray for an onslaught. Yellowed confetti bits fell away as I put the stack on the heap to be bagged up and trashed. By now, I'd learned that paper flaking that badly meant the appraiser's regretful head shake and the murmur, "Too badly eroded, Miss Aim." As with each of the 7 rooms I'd managed so far, I sorted the contents into piles. Throwaway was by far the largest. To be appraised had interesting things in it beyond the scads of dolls grandmother had collected. Keep was actually 2 sub-piles, one for mother and one for me. Object after object to be evaluated and sorted. Old magazines and flutters of candy wrappers. So much clothing, most of it absurdly formal, scratchy with ancient starch. Theater props piled on top of grab bags she'd picked up at church rummage sales, still unopened. Half-filled perfume bottles and compacts full of sweet dust. And then there were oddities. A picture stitched of human hair showing a castle on a cliff. An enormous crystal ball a good foot and a half wide. A mechanical banjo trio that played itself, complete with a library of antebellum songs to choose from. A basket stuffed with sandalwood fans. The rotting thing turned out to be a heap of furs that, when stirred, sent up a stench reminiscent of old sauerkraut. It sent me out in the hallway for a while to lean against the yellowing wallpaper and breathe in fresher air. The doll collection was worth a good bit, perhaps, I'd been told, but nothing on the scale of financial windfall I'd hoped for. Grandmother had been wealthy, even though she'd kept her spending discreet, aside from this strange mishmash of a house. Where had all that money gone? And why had she saved everything? I think I'll stop there because that's a good point to stop.
That was awesome. I love how well you create the atmosphere of the story and how much we learn about the grandmother in her absence. I think like going through all of her trash at the beginning gives you a really good sense of who she was, and you do a really good job of that.
I think it's fun to do lists of things. There's a wonderful Tim O'Brien novel called The Things They Carried in Their Pockets, which is a Vietnam war novel, but it's told in the, like, here are the things that they carried. Lovely, lovely book. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are a lot of lists throughout this story too. Like we get more of them the more she cleans. I like that.
Oh yeah.
So this is a novelette, right? How would you describe the difference between a novella, a novelette, and a short story?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is just to go by word length, and if you're doing that, it's defined as up to 7,500 words as a short story, and then up to 7,500 to 10,700 500 is Novelette, and then after that is Novella up to 40,000, and then with just chaos ensues. I don't know. It's interesting because in a short story, you really have to sort of grab one thing and go for it.
Mm-hmm.
And with longer stories, you can kind of noodle around a bit and have, for one thing, long lists of things in a way that you might have to condense for a shorter story. I just had Margaret Dunlap just did an amazing story class on TV structure for Novella writers, which I was really excited by because people kept coming and saying, could you teach a class on novellas? And I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing when I write a novella. I just kind of, it's long. Yeah, Shannon, it's an amazing book. So she talked about it in terms of it being like a TV 1 hour episode with 5 acts. And of course, and that's kind of defined by the commercials. And so I would think that the longer a piece is, the more it has to kind of lean towards that traditional story structure. Whereas the shorter you are, particularly when you're kind of like wandering around in flash fiction land, you can do wildly experimental structural stuff.
Yeah, I like that answer. So you mentioned diesel punk as part of the inception of this story. Could you explain a little about what diesel punk is?
Oh yeah, this was a really interesting question because somebody came and said diesel punk and would you write it? And of course I said sure, and then went away and looked up what it was. And so diesel punk is basically the thing after steampunk, and it's got gasoline. So it's set during World War I up to World War II is if you want to think about it that way. But I discovered, of course, there's, not just steampunk and diesel punk, there's cyberpunk and ribopunk and splatterpunk and hope punk and all these kind of wonderful punk genres. So it was fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I learned about hope punk recently from Alexandra Rowland, who we interviewed recently. And they were describing it for us, and I'd never heard of it before, but I'm learning a lot about all of these different punk genres. It's fun. So this does take place after World War II. Did you do any like historical research? Is like Susan Day based on anyone?
No, I was actually pretty careful with that because it's weird. Whenever you write something that's sort of alternative history, you have to sort of figure out how closely you're going to align with reality. And so I picked some fairly broad strokes because I didn't want to fall down the rabbit hole of now I must learn everything about World War II robotics, right? So it's a bit cartoony, actually, in those places. It is not for someone who wants kind of gritty realism as far as that goes.
Right. It reminded me of like kind of Marvel, like a Captain America-esque, where it's like you don't need to know how they built the arm or the serum,
That's it, exactly. The Red Skull had this base. There was a robot on it, yeah.
Yeah, I liked that. So you were talking about it following a structure. How do you decide when you have like the basis of the story, or the seed for the story, which kind you want it to be? Do you figure it out as you go, or do you have an idea at the beginning?
Well, stories come in different ways to me, and sometimes it's an idea for a title, or sometimes it's a character, sometimes it's a scene, or sometimes it's I hated story X, and now I'm going to write something that reacts to it. I've actually had stories run away from me. I was writing a story for an anthology recently where they said, okay, the upper limit is 8,000 words. And I had to keep mailing the editor and saying, it's going to be longer. And I didn't feel too bad about that because the anthology before that, I had been the person who came in with a 1,500 word short story and gave room to everybody else. So I felt there was a certain amount due me. It was just like the story needed enough room to be told in, right? It's sort of like, I need a scene to explain this. I need to have them wander around now at the feast. I need to have them swim together. That sounds sort of ineffable, unfortunately.
Well, it's creating itself as it goes, right?
Yeah. And that's one of the joys of fiction for me. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not a very methodical outliner, is I love writing the story and discovering what happens. I'm working on one right now where I kind of know the end, but I'm really curious as to how they're going to get there. So it's fun.
Is your process different when you're writing like a shorter one, or when you're given the constraints for some, like an anthology you're doing or something, than if you're just writing a story without being asked for it to be in something?
It depends. Actually, it's more accurate to say my process doesn't differ so much between stories as between, say, story and novel. The novel, I've got to kind of sit down and really sort of grind through it. With the story, I basically sit down and I do 30-minute writing sprints where I just sort of go, and then at the end of 30 minutes, I pause and stretch and think about things. And I don't always write in consecutive order. A lot of times I'll kind of be at the end of the story and I'll be like, well, I don't think that's the order that the scenes are really in, and I'll rearrange it. But with stories, I just sort of let them come, and I don't worry about how long they're going to be, because I think actually one of the best ways for a writer to really paralyze themselves is to think too much about the result and not just sort of abandon themselves to the process. I just worked with someone recently, in fact, who had they'd had a terrible problem, which is that the very first story that they wrote and had published got all sorts of critical acclaim and did super well. And I said, so how's the next one going? And they said, well, I haven't written in 2 years. And it was because every time they sat down, they was like, no, I got to knock it out of the ballpark again. So you gotta write without expectations. At least I do.
And that's expectations for how the story will shape. But what about expectations for like the reader? Do you have any readers in mind when you're writing, or are you just writing for yourself or the characters?
I write the kind of book I like to read. The book that's coming out with Tor Macmillan next year, in fact, the space opera, You Sexy Thing, is me sitting down and saying, I want to write a book full of banter and people being kind of, pissy with each other, even when they're super affectionate. And I love foods. They're going to be restaurateurs, and I like blowing things up. So this will happen. And so I write the sort of stuff I like to read.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think if the author needs to be interested in what they're writing for the reader to be interested in it. So if you're writing what you want to read, then automatically it'll be more interesting to anyone reading it.
Oh, yeah.
That's good. So you mentioned that you were asked about writing a diesel punk story, and that was kind of the inception of this. Were there any other like elements that you pulled from other things before you sat down to write this story?
There's actually a lot of little in-jokes. The mechanical banjo trio is a reference to Rachel Swirsky, who's a friend and whose parents collect mechanical implements. And so when and then the picture stitched in human hair is a reference to a kid's book that I love, Ellen Boston's An Enemy at Green No. And so when I was doing the objects, I just had a lot of fun putting those together and bringing in little references like that. Am I a hoarder? No, but I have had family members that are hoarders, and I have dealt with trying to clean it up. And I think I'm actually kind of fascinated by it because it's clearly a mental disorder for some people. Then for other people, it's clearly just they just need something that they have control over, and the only thing they can control is these objects, and so they accumulate them. But no, I tend to go through and try to get rid of stuff every once in a while. In fact, because I've seen people hoard, but I'm bad. I've got like briar horses and books and coffee cups and things. So yeah.
Yeah. And in Carpe Glitter, the grandmother had to move a lot as a child. And so like it was a reaction, as you mentioned in the story, to how she grew up. And then we also see that same kind of a thing trickle down in the generations after her, with the mother also moving a lot, and the daughter like keeping everything in a pack so she can leave at any time. I really liked the like generational connections that you built into this story. Do you want to talk about like the creation of those relationships?
Oh, sure. I am fascinated by sort of kind of the grandmother mother-daughter relationship, partially because I see it played out in my own family, and I see like pieces of myself in my mother. I see pieces of myself in my grandmother, and just like the grandmother in the book, my grandmother was not a very pleasant person, but she absolutely adored me. And so there was kind of this weird juxtaposition where I had this person who just really hated the rest of the world in some ways, but I was the oldest grandkid. And I think that in fiction, we don't explore mother-daughter relationships, particularly in fantasy, the way that some other relationships get examined. And particularly nowadays, I think maternal and family relationships are changing so much. And they're hard, right? I mean, I saw a cartoon the other day where it's a mother and a daughter sitting on a couch, and the mother says, "Why don't we ever talk?" And the daughter says, "Because it would require me acknowledging that you hurt me deeply in my childhood in ways that we can never recover from." And the mother goes, "Okay, then."
That comment got deeper than I expected it to.
Right. It's moms. I mean, moms are particularly for women, right? They're the person that the first person to model ourselves over after that we see, really, in most circumstances, not all.
Yeah, and I think one of the lines in the book was about how like she saw her mother doing things that her grandmother did, and sometimes she saw herself doing things that she thought of as their traits, and that made me think of kind of programming, especially with the automaton in the book, where it's like the same coding being passed down. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the relationship between humans and machines in your books?
Well, I think people have patterns, right? And people have patterns that they have lived with, and often the solution to a problem is to move out of the pattern, but it is so hard to get out of it unless you see it for what it is. And that's what family relationships are, right? They're these patterns of behavior that you can't get out of until you perceive them from a distance. And so in many ways, the automaton has more free will than some of the other things or people in the story.
Yeah. And her hoarding is also kind of a pattern. And it took, I guess she probably wasn't aware of it, but her granddaughter sure was, coming back into the house after not having seen it for so long.
And cluttered houses like that, houses full of magical objects, I think are often a trope in fantasy stories. Actually, I was really annoyed when Carpe Glitter came out because Ursula Vernon had a story that came out at the same time that was also about somebody going to investigate their hoarding grandparents. And I was like, oh God, Ursula did it better. Oh, but luckily they're different enough that you can enjoy both. And I highly recommend actually Ursula's. It's written under T. Kingfisher. It's called The Twisted Ones. It's just really good, terrifying book. Much, much scarier than mine. Mine's mildly scary, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I feel like the use of tropes, or like the use of similar moments in different stories, does not make them the same story.
Oh no.
You know, you can enjoy the same thing retold 800 different ways. What are some other stories that you would recommend to people that like Carpe Glitter?
I just finished this book. I got an advanced reading copy, and luckily it's coming out next month, so I'm not taunting people too badly with it. I'm sorry, I'm tilting it in the wrong direction. It's The Brass Queen by Elizabeth Chatsworth, which is steampunk with a very strong female protagonist. She's actually a weapons dealer, perhaps ethically questionable, but a really fun steampunk. Other stuff that I've read recently, I just read Bruce Sterling's put out a collection of stories. It turns out Bruce Sterling has been writing science fiction under the pseudonym Bruno Argent in Italian. And so this is a collection of the Bruno Argent stories, which apparently he's been publishing. And they're really good. They're really stellar. Yeah, that's a couple of things I've been reading lately that I really enjoyed.
What are some of the things that you read when you were growing up that maybe influenced your writing now?
Oh, actually, I'll show you something. One second.
Absolutely.
This is a kind of cool story. My grandmother was a children's author, and she wrote young adult sports novels. She was the author of such masterpieces as Basketball Bones and Football Flash and Martha Norton, Operation Fitness USA. So she used to go to book fairs and she'd bring me stuff back. And at one point she brought me back this book called Turn Not Pale, Beloved Snail, a book about writing, among other things, aimed at kids. And she signed it for me. You can see the signing, and then you can see my own infant, book plate and all of that. I read this book a bajillion times. And if you look in the back, there's a book list. It had recommended reading, and I worked through all of those books. So the cool thing is, this year I was moving books around, and I was looking at this because I've carried it around for now decades. So I wrote to the author. And I said, I want you to know that I've been, I carried this around, and this book meant so much to me, and I won a Nebula Award this year. And she wrote me back the nicest letter. It's just been so lovely. So yeah, it's a wonderful book about kids and writing. Had a huge influence on me as a kid. Sorry, I'm getting a little weepy just because it was so cool, right? I got this letter, and she was like, oh, I wrote the book that I wish somebody had given me when I was a kid. And that was really neat. So the lesson is, if somebody writes a book that you love, you should reach out and tell them, because no author is going to object to that. Other stuff that I read, I was one of those voracious readers as a child. And so at some point I had made my way. First, I made my way through all the fiction in the children's room, and then I started reading the mythology and folklore, which was the closest thing to fiction that I could find, because it was still stories. And they finally said, okay, we're going to let you go down and you can pick from the adult books. And my parents didn't care. My parents are always like, whatever you want to read. Very laissez-faire, but the South Bend librarian was a bit more stringent. So I went immediately to the science fiction and fantasy section, and I picked up this book by this guy named H.P. Lovecraft. And I took it home and I read it, and I had nightmares for a week. I was terrified.
Mhm.
And I couldn't tell anyone because if I told them, then I would not be allowed to go back and read more delicious H.P. Lovecraft books or
Mhm.
any of the other. It was a very small fantasy and science fiction section, but it was rich. Thank
Mhm.
you, Shanna. Appreciate that.
Mhm. And your first foray into the adult section, and you got nightmares. Oh no.
Oh, it was. If people are familiar, it's the one with. I think it's the something like the Events of the Witch House, but it had Brown Jenkin, which was this tiny creature with a human face that looked sort of like a monkey and a cat, and it
Mm.
just Brown Jenkin haunted me still haunts me actually.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like the human face would do it. It's that uncanny valley of a little too human.
Ah, yeah.
What were some of the books in the back of the Beloved Snail that you read your way down?
One was L.M. Boston, who wrote this series called the Green Now series. They're set in, I want to say England, but it's a woman, kind of this kid has a grandmother that has an ancient magic house full of artifacts. And so there's a whole series of those. I read George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblins and The Princess and Curdie. Read a lot of E. Nesmith.
Mhm.
Yeah. Walter Farley. I discovered Walter Farley because of that. That kicked off my I Love Horses phase. Yes,
Mhm.
that's it. The Children of Green Now. Excuse me.
Right.
Oh, and Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransom. There, she actually had a lot of old English children's books. Now that I think about it, I am better read perhaps in English children's literature of the early 19th century.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a couple there that I don't know. That's awesome. I'll have to look them up. So what are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? I'm looking around because I'm actually partially through. It's A Declaration of the Rights of Magicians by
Mm.
H.G. Perry, which actually came out this summer. But as you know, the to be read pile has been huge. And I've been loving dipping into the Best American Science Fiction Fantasy of 2019, which Maria Machado edited, and which is just dynamite. I love reading good short stories, and we've been having it's some of the best there. We've actually been doing this short story club where we've been reading basically classic science fiction, but it's taken from an anthology called Women of Wonder. So it's women writing in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
We've had a couple interviews with some short story collectors of sci-fi fantasy with women. Lisa Yazek, who wrote The Future is Female, and I forget the other author we talked to. But there's a couple collections that we've discussed in other videos. If you should check those out. But yeah, The Future is Female with the like 50s pulp fiction of the different sci-fi authors. That was really good. Yeah.
Yeah, we've been having a lot of fun with it. We just finished When I Was Miss Dow by Sonia Dorman, which I had not read before. Just kind of a really interesting take on colonialism, I thought. So.
Yeah. Coming back to, I guess, your story, do you ever think you'll revisit this world again, or these characters?
I would like to actually. What I would really like to do is do this as a kind of like I would love to see it as a TV series. I think it'd be fun to have kind of the ghost of Susan Day and Persephone Aim out solving crimes. But no, I think it'd be fun to do a novel. I've got a lot of other projects in the pipeline, so probably not for at least a few years.
So the authors that we interviewed, were Lisi Yazet, Gideon Marcus, and Marie Vibert were the panel for the sci-fi authors, history of women in speculative fiction. So, but yeah, I would love to see more of this. And you're right, a TV show would be great because there's so many good like visual elements, like that one moment where the dress like collapses, or is like a ghost is wearing it. There's lots of good visual things.
It'd be fun.
And I think a crime-solving duo with the ghost and the automaton body would be amazing, especially since she's got kind of the genie, the 3 wishes kind of a thing, but she's managed to get stuck on wish number 2, so she doesn't have to go away. I like that.
Lots of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. And I do feel like there's some of the world that could still be explored. Like we still have questions at the end of the short story, which I think is a good thing, because you don't want to wrap up everything. You want to be left wondering and thinking about it. But I definitely still had some questions.
Well, I kind of want people to wonder, like, does the FBI really kind of like, is there a special division that goes out for this, or lots of possibilities there?
Right, like with the power to offer her a job, like a well-paying job to get her away from it and things like that. Yeah. There's definitely some people in the background hunting for things. And I also had like questions about her past, like why her mom and grandmom fought at like when she was a kid, because we know kind of why they got upset when she was just before she was born, when they dismantled Heinrich. But then it was years later when they split up for good. So I have lots of questions about it that I would love to see answered in more stories.
That's it. Now you make me want to go back and start poking at it.
Good. Is there anything you're working on now that you can tell us about?
I'm working on book 2 of the space opera, which is tentatively entitled Devil's Gun. I have it sort of planned out as a 10-book series, which Tor has not sort of freaked out yet about, although they're only committed to 3 books, so we'll see what happens. So yeah, I'm working on that. I just turned in the 3rd book of the Tabat Quartet, Exiles of Tabat, which will come out in May of next year. And I've got to finish the 4th book of that quartet, because it would really be kind of awful to people to write 3 books of a quartet and then flake out.
Yeah.
But I know that's actually, it's on its way. I've started sketching that out, and I'm having fun with it. It's just that now I have 3 books worth of loose threads that all must be tied up.
Mm-hmm. Is it hard to keep everything separate when you're writing multiple projects at the same time?
It is. And I try not to work on multiple books at the same time, or at least I try not to be writing 2 books at the same time. I have usually one that I'm writing and one that I'm editing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm super excited about the Tor book, because partially this was a book that I wrote because I was going to self-publish. And I was like, okay, I'm going to just write, military sci-fi with some fantasy, and I'll just do whatever I want to. And I wrote it very quickly. And then I was like, okay, I need my agent to sign off on this before I can self-publish it. And I sent it to him and said, please sign off on this. And he said, well, wait a minute. How about I try to sell it? And I was like, no, you're going to do what you did with the first 2 books, which is you're going to take it and shop it around, and you're going to say nice things about it. And that's great, but nobody's going to buy the book again. And I was like, I really like this book. I want it to go out there. Mm-hmm. And long story short, he did talk me into letting him rep it. And I'm really glad that he did, because it is going to come out with Tor, which this is a big deal. Yeah. I'm really excited about that.
You should be. That is awesome. Yeah. I hope they do pick up all 10 of the series. That would be great. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to have one of those long, smoldering romance lines where by the time you get to book 10, you're just like, oh God, I gotta find out what happens.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that'll be fun. Yeah. We like a lot of space operas. I read it again. So.
Yeah. Space opera is good stuff. It's fun.
That's true. Well, I think besides all of the questions that I don't think I should ask in case they're answered in later books, like about like the other will option and the verbal the verbiage that the will used, or like spoilers and things like that. I think you've answered pretty much all of my questions, which was great. I loved listening to you. Susan has a question.
Oh, this is an excellent question. So speaking of self-publishing versus publishing house, which kind of advice do I give writers about those two avenues? And I get this all the time, right? Because this is the big question of our time is, do you go the traditional route and try to get an agent and go with what used to be the big six and are now the big five, or do you indie publish? And the thing about indie publishing is that it's very quick, but you are fighting discoverability. And so either you need to be very good at marketing, or you need to already have a following from somewhere, or you need to be willing to put the time into building up that following by consistently putting out interesting, good stuff. And there are people who are publishing and are publishing kind of like wonderful indie stuff, but they are putting it out consistently. They are delivering it, and they didn't hit when they first started off. I think most of the really successful indie publishers would tell you they also put a lot of work into it. They put a huge amount of work into it, in fact. On the other hand, the indie publishing people have much more control over their careers. The thing about traditional publishing is that you are at the mercy of the publisher. I mean, as I said, my first two novels that I gave my agent, he shopped around. Beasts of Tabat, I ended up selling to Wordfire myself because I knew the acquisitions editor there and was like, hey, Peter, I got a book. And not everyone's in that position. Questions that my students ask the most. Well, one is, how do you tell the good ideas from the bad ideas, right? How do you tell the good idea that's going to turn into a killer story versus the idea that's just going to sit on your hard drive, half finished in your folder? And the answer to that actually is that there are no bad ideas, I have discovered. It's just that you approach different ideas in different ways. And Michael Swanwick has a short story that takes place on the surface of a giant grasshopper. And if you want to talk about an idea that if somebody came to me and said, hey, Cat, I'm going to write this story, I would go, well, that's an interesting idea in my diplomatic fashion, maybe even not that diplomatically. But no, if you different ideas you can do different things with. In fact, I've written a book on this called Moving from Idea to Draft. That's about all the different forms that ideas can come in. And it's one of the classes that I give. Other questions that students ask, how do I succeed? Well, I mean, how do I stay productive? I think has been a huge one in 2020. And that's why we've been doing the daily co-working. And we've now got like kind of even, they're going most of the time just so people can drop in and work together. And the school and getting a chance to work with people has been, for me, the thing that kept me productive, kept me working. We have we're all going to stay off social media for the next 2 hours pledge that we take. And sometimes we manage to do it. And sometimes we don't.
Yeah, I feel like with genre fiction, especially the no bad ideas thing, like if you tried to explain the plot of any fantasy novel to anyone, it would sound buck wild. So like, I think in fantasy especially, you have to be like open to all sorts of ideas.
Yeah. And it's, for people that sort of just write to discover, the sort of the fear of that is that you're going to write to discover and you're going to write yourself into a corner, right? You're going to write and you're going to be like, okay, I've created this thing that cannot become a story. But part of sort of becoming a consistent good writer is learning to trust your ability in revision.
Mm.
And knowing that no matter how crappy your first draft is, and everybody produces first drafts that are just terrible, except Ted Chiang. I'm pretty sure Ted Chiang has perfect drafts because he's just that smart. But most of us are producing horrible, shitty, crap, terrible, messy, sloppy things. And you got to learn to trust that you will be able to turn it into something, because you will. You really will.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael's comic, I highly recommend you put I'm sorry, put the.
Yeah. In the comments, we've put a lot of the books or authors that have been mentioned, so you should check all of those out. I did think of one more question that I meant to ask, which was, why did you name the main character Persephone? Was there a connection to the myth?
I just liked the name.
Okay. I was thinking maybe it was the mother-daughter. I was thinking it was the mother-daughter relationship, like Persephone and Demeter, because there's so much of that relationship that's connected to the myth too.
It actually was originally, for some reason, I don't remember why I was doing this. It was a palindrome at first. And her name was Emma something, or I can't remember exactly how it went. And then I was like, that is so goofy that people are just going to look at the name, and I need to swap in something else. And so I made it Persephone, because part of the problem as a writer is when you're kind of trying to figure out names is sometimes you find you have go-to names, right? It's like, I've written 5 stories now. The character's named Laura, and there's a Laura every time. What are you going to do with that?
And then the people reading it will be like, is it the same Laura? All these universes are connected.
That's it. You don't want to make the kind of mistakes that somebody then mortifies you by coming in saying, well, this is a pattern. And you're like,
Everything's intentional. Yeah.
It's like the cat falling off the wall and going, yes, I meant to do that.
Yeah. I feel like readers can always find patterns. So like with Persephone, and I was like, it must be the mother-daughter relationship, even though it was just a thing you stuck in. But like the people reading it will find something new in anything you write.
And that's I think one of the fun things about writing is that when you're doing it, your unconscious mind is throwing in all sorts of patterns. And I think one of the fun things about rewriting is going back and being like, oh, look, if I kind of coax this out a little better, it'll be pleasing. And then if I can, I did this, now I'm going to do it again in this chapter. And it's just, that's the fun part, the finicky little tweaks like that.
Yeah. I feel like when talking about the writing process, so many people talk about the first drafts. You want to talk a little bit more about the editing?
Oh, sure. With editing, I think it's important, to learn to trust yourself. And I do a 3-part process where I work on what I call kind of the big ticket items. And then I move down to basically kind of like the scene level, and then just kind of keep going down and going down and going down. And the reason for that is I don't want to spend 6 hours polishing a scene and then go, well, shit, I don't need that scene and it's going to go away. It's much more efficient for me to lop it out. I use a book called The 10% Solution by Ken Rand, R-A-N-D, which, in the interest of full disclosure, I wrote the introduction to the 10th anniversary edition. And it was because I had actually been getting people at conventions to go up to the publisher and ask when the electronic edition was going to be out, because I was so irritated that there was no electronic edition. I let him know what I was doing, and it got to be a joke, which is why I did the introduction. But it's a great little book. And one of the nice things about it is the very last step is read it out loud. And the nice thing about that is once you've read it out loud, it's time for it to go out. No more dithering, no more, I'm going to just read it through one more time. No, you read it out loud, you've polished it, time to go.
I like that. I feel like often one of the questions is, how do you know when it's done?
Yeah.
And so like having a kind of a concrete, here's when it's done.
Yes.
Very
Yes.
useful.
Because that's one of the places where you can get hung up. There's certain sort of spots in the writing process that are kind of, they're the jumps that you have to make. And that's one of them. Another is that point in a first manuscript where it's about at the 90% mark. And there, for a lot of people, just that last 10%, that never gets done.
Yeah, endings are hard.
Yeah. No, writing, it's this weird thing because, it's not hard in the sense that it's not bricklaying. You're not, doing physical labor or anything, but in another sense, it is one of the hardest things that I know, but also the most exhilarating when it's going well.
Yeah. If anybody has any more questions, now's the time to ask them, because otherwise I think we'll probably wrap up for the night. Thank you so much, Cat, for joining us.
Thank you.
I loved your story, and I will definitely check out your other series. And I hope Tor does pick up all 10, and I hope this gets made into a TV show, because that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been delightful, and it's been fun to virtually be in Georgia for a brief moment where I'm sure it's warmer than it is here in Seattle. Today was one of the colder, but yeah, you're definitely welcome back in Georgia whenever it's safe to come, and you should come check out our store. We'd love to host you in person sometime. Awesome. Thank you, and everybody have a good night. Take care, everyone.